Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. It is our privilege to be joined for a special three-part series by one of the country's foremost experts on China, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, who is a distinguished former diplomat who has notably served as India's foreign secretary as well as our ambassador to China. Join us for what will arguably be a revealing deep dive and be one step closer to understanding China. Mr. Gokhale, the Chinese Communist Party is often popularly misconstrued, I think, as an ideological monolith of sorts. Some sources seem to think that there has been a degree of ideological diversity in the party, at least since the opening up of the Chinese markets around the time of Deng Xiaoping onwards. What role do you think ideological diversity has on decision making in the contemporary CCP today?
The CCP has actually existed for a little more than 100 years. And the guiding principle is that the party must remain the highest priority above everything else. If that is an ideology, then certainly the party has a consistent ideology. But where Marxism, Leninism is concerned, I think the ideological differences within the party have been a phenomenon right from the outset. In fact, many people do not know that Mao became the leader of the Communist Party only 15 years after its founding and after a lot of ideological struggle with others. In the initial phase, the leaders of the Communist Party wanted to follow the Soviet example of urban revolution. And the ideology was essentially very much a Marxian ideology and a Leninist approach. Whereas Mao Zedong understood that in a primarily agrarian society, you wouldn't have a large number of workers who would rise up in revolt. And therefore, the communist revolution in China had to be an agrarian centric revolution. So it took him 15 years to put his ideas into place in such a way that he could control the party, and that happened only around 1935 or 1936. And it is interesting that in the next 40 years, until he died in 1976, although he continued to dominate the party, there were a number of ideological challenges posed to him. He consolidated ideological control by formulating a body of ideology called Mao Zedong Thought, which he formalized in 1945 and which became the guiding principle of the party and continues to be the guiding principle of the party in name. But in reality, in the 1950s and in the 1960s, a number of his own colleagues and compatriots challenged him in terms of implementation of that ideology as economic or national security policy. For instance, in 1958, when Mao started the Great Leap Forward, the communalization of industry and agriculture, which was not only an economic disaster but a human disaster in China. 20 million people are believed to have starved. The challenge came ideologically from leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who in 1962 sidelined Mao by saying that this was not sensible economics and that while it was our objective to achieve communism in China, Mao's way was not the right way to do so. Similarly, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966 primarily because his own opponents in the party were using ideology against him, and because many of them supported the Soviet Union, which was also liberalizing after Stalin under Khrushchev, and which Mao felt was a sort of challenge to him because he identified with Stalin and his views and not with the relatively open views of Khrushchev. So ideology has continued to play a major role in Chinese politics. Now, in the 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping started the reform, ideology began to play a role in economics as well. All the leaders were agreed that the disaster of the Cultural Revolution cannot be repeated, and therefore reform and opening up is required. But the definition of reform and opening up became a question of big debate and discussion. Deng wanted it to be swift and wide open. There were a number of other leaders who said it should be limited and the state must still command the heights of the economy. Very much Nehruvian in approach. And therefore, that the public sector must dominate an economy where, of course, a private sector is also deemed necessary. And therefore, what you saw, and what in fact led to the Tiananmen incident of 1989, was the differentiation on economic ideology and to a certain extent on political ideology playing out on a national stage. And therefore, ideology continues to be a factor that both unites and divides the party. I know there is a general thinking that Xi Jinping is dominant and that there is no ideological challenge to him. But
Right.
I would think that merely because it is not visible, we should not presume it doesn't exist. Very often, when there is a dominant leader such as Mao or Xi, and even in certain periods when Deng was there, this ideological differentiation or challenge went subterranean. But it never entirely disappeared, and it always surfaced eventually to challenge the existing ideology. Sometimes, of course, the challenge was successful, on other occasions, it was defeated. But I suspect that the current anti corruption campaign of President Xi Jinping, which is targeting so many of his political opponents,
Yep.
cannot be on the grounds of corruption alone. I think it reflects to some extent a difference in thinking. And that difference in thinking is significant. So we need to watch political developments in China because sometimes, unlike in democracies where these ideological differences are played out in public, in China it's a much more slower process.
At least until the onset of Xi Jinping, there were tangible factions within the CCP. Uh, are they still as tangible? If so, could you tell us more about them?
If you by tangible mean visible, no.
No.
But if you by tangible mean do they exist, I suspect they do. Uh, a party as large as this, any political party as large as that, is unlikely to be a monolith, however much a single leader wishes that to be the case. Ultimately, there has to be a certain amount of delegation of authority, both ideologically and in terms of control. And once you delegate authority, you start creating small kingdoms of influence and power. Now, in Mao and Deng both struggled with what they called mountain topism. In other words, individual leaders sitting on tops of mountains and controlling their own little mountain. This is a term that Mao coined, and it is something that the term that comes up regularly in Chinese writings. And both Mao and Deng struggled to control it. They were able to control it quite successfully sometimes. On other occasions, they couldn't, but they never eliminated factions. So that even when Mao died, for instance, the Gang of Four was a faction. The PLA was a significant faction which actually was able to arrest the Gang of Four and restore order and a semblance of political authority back to the party. And right through the period of Deng, that the factionalism was very evident in the party and it was fully manifested during the 1989 Tiananmen crisis. Uh, in the 1990s and 2000s, in the post-Deng period, the factions became very prominent because the leaders were less dominant than Mao and Deng. And therefore, the Shanghai faction, which was believed to be the faction supported by President Jiang Zemin, the Youth League faction, which was the faction believed to be supported by President Hu Jintao, the military faction, the PLA faction, these factions began to gain salience. One of the major reasons why Xi Jinping tightened control in the party was because he realized that if factionalism was allowed to grow, eventually you would topple the party center. And it was an entirely valid reason. But he has gone behind factions of all varieties, targeting high placed individuals along with their lieutenants and the cadre in an effort to centralize power. Does that mean he has been able to eliminate factions? I doubt that very much. So long as this party remains huge and the country remains huge and interests do not necessarily fully converge, there will be groups of influence within the party who are not in sync with the current leader. When these could coalesce to form a challenge, or when these could surface for us to see, is another matter. But I would hesitate to rule out the possibility that factions exist. In fact, I would probably think they do very much exist.
Correct. And many believe that Deng Xiaoping essentially transformed the party state uh, as an authoritarian oligarchy to precisely prevent the one man rule you had during Mao's time. Xi Jinping has arguably been able to upend that and is once again centralizing power. It's looking like one man rule that was reminiscent of Mao Zedong again. What are the ramifications of such centralization on Chinese governance and even society today? Is it as dark as it was perhaps during Mao's time, or is it something entirely different?
I'd agree with you that President Xi Jinping is re-centralizing power and, in a sense, reintroducing the idea of supreme leader, which Deng had consciously tried to dilute because of the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, which included both the suffering for the people and his own personal suffering. Essentially, what Xi Jinping has done is undo many of the party and state regulations that prevented the growth of a cult like figure. By removing age limits to office, term limits to office, as well as by removing the idea that there should be a regular turnaround of party leaders and collective responsibility at the highest echelon of the party leadership so that no one leader could dominate. Systematically, all these checks and balances, whether in the party's constitution or the state constitution, have been removed by Xi Jinping. And clearly, the objective is to centralize power and to be the dominant leader. However, I would be cautious in equating Xi with Mao because they were fundamentally different personalities at fundamentally different periods of time. Mao took power at a time when the situation within China was powerless, when the party had not consolidated its position. And his own insecurity led to him engendering a constant state of chaos in China. He reveled in chaos. And he felt that the more chaos you created, the more you could control the party, you could control the narrative, and you could dominate the system. I think Xi's fundamental training and orientation is a fear of chaos and a desire for stability and predictability. And therefore, the control seems to be to minimize the possibility of an unpredictable event or of a grey rhino or a black swan event happening in the party, and to enhance the chances that he could actually predict and hold on to power predictably. So I think to that extent, their methods might be similar, but I think their objectives are a little different in this case. Of course, whether or not this is the best way of holding on to power, only time and history will tell. But as I did mention in answer to your earlier question, despite all the controls and power that Mao was able to put into place and to aggregate, he was never able to quell internal rebellion within the party or to guarantee that his ideas would prevail after his death. In fact, it has been ironic that within months of Mao's death, this dominant leader who was the founder of the People's Republic and whose ideology they still talk of today and whose photograph is on the Tiananmen Square's walls, his ideology virtually vanished, never to be used again within months of his death.
Correct. And it's interesting you brought up the concept of stability. When we look at these ethnic minority regions, Xinjiang, of course, being one, Tibet being the other, you have also written that Chinese policy, uh, very recently in this article on Tibet, is being driven by stability, uh, a sense of security and stability. Those are the primary guiding factors. Yet it seems that during Xi Jinping's tenure, the level of oppression, surveillance, and he's even talked about a policy of sinicization, at least with respect to Tibet. When it comes to Xinjiang, we hear about Uyghur re-education camps, internment facilities, surveillance. Where does this sense of, I guess, renewed insecurity about these areas come from that, at least in their mind, justify such measures?
Well, historically, large parts of northwest and southwest China today, the People's Republic of China, has not been Chinese territory. Chinese control over Tibet was very tenuous until maybe 1790s when they signed the treaty, and even thereafter, the Chinese Empire had representatives and some military forces in Tibet, but left the Tibetans very much to their own devices. And the same was true of the northwestern territory where the Muslims and the Uyghurs are resident. Now, in 1911, when the Chinese Empire collapsed, the Chinese actually lost control of both the southwest and the northwest. So, when the Communist Party took power in 1949, it is obvious that one of its first priorities was to regain that control. And that's why the need to re emphasize constantly ethnic and religious unity and stability in the country. Now, this has been a struggle at one level and much more successful at the other. Where it has been successful is essentially in physically integrating these territories into China. Because the massive infrastructure investments that have taken place, road, rail, and air, have integrated the northwest and the southwest of the People's Republic of China into the rest of the Chinese mainland in virtually a manner which it will be extremely difficult to decouple from. They have essentially gained solid physical control over these territories. The problem is of the control of the mind, spiritual control, cultural control, intellectual control. Those continue to remain powerless and tenuous because ethnic minorities in the southwest and the northwest are asserting their identity. And unlike India, where cultural diversity is not only appreciated but constitutionally recognized, in the case of China, whereas it is constitutionally recognized, it is never done in practice. This effort at sinicization of whether it is religion, culture, tradition, practice is a constant theme in the Chinese Communist Party. So, whereas on the surface they will mouth diversity, their secret desire is to have complete unity on their terms, on Chinese terms. And in the case of Xi Jinping, this has been exacerbated by the fear that as China becomes a great power, its adversaries will seek to undermine it. And the easiest place in their minds where it can be undermined is in the vulnerable underbelly, which is the northwest and the southwest, which ironically does not have the large Chinese Han population, but which is essentially populated by ethnic minorities. And therefore, it becomes very essential in the minds of the Chinese leaders not only to gain physical control, but to gain control over the spiritual, cultural, and intellectual institutions of these places. That is why the appointment or selection of religious leaders or cultural leaders in these areas is now gaining saliency in Chinese politics, and why who becomes the next Dalai Lama, for instance, is not understandable to the outside world, because for the outside world this is a matter of faith, of religion, and in most democratic societies you don't interfere in that process. In India, we don't determine who the Shankaracharya of any mutt will be, nor who the head imam of the Jama Masjid will be, or who heads any Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, or Parsi institution. But this is not the case with China. There is an anxiety that if they do not control an ethnic group intellectually or religiously, challenges will emerge from there, and external forces will interfere in that process. So that's really the thinking which has gone towards an excessive centralization over the ethnic borderlands and the religion, where of course there are also religious minorities in the current regime.
I'm glad you raised the post 14 Dalai Lama scenario. You wrote a very interesting article on it just now. uh, in Carnegie, and I encourage all our viewers to actually go and read it. Very interestingly, you took the subject beyond just the India-China bilateral. You explained the U.S.'s role as a party as well, along, I guess, with the Tibetan diaspora. Very interestingly, you cautioned India against making any unilateral conciliatory gestures when this scenario should present itself. Why don't we start from there? What is your thinking behind that?
Well, in terms of the broader India China relationship, what we have seen in 75 years is a sense in Beijing that India needs to be sensitive to their concerns. But there is no reciprocal obligation on China to deliver on India's concerns. This is playing out across the board, all the way from our a desire to be a member of the nuclear suppliers group at one end, for instance, and on the other hand, on our claims relating to the line of actual control or the border on the other. Uh, it includes economic issues where they feel we must open our markets to them, but they are not obliged to give us reciprocal trading facilities in China. It extends to the cultural field where they feel that they are free to engage with Indian religious and spiritual communities like the Buddhists, but the Indian spiritual groups should not have any engagement with China. So across the board, there is a one-way discourse here that you must be sensitive to my issues. I don't have to be sensitive to yours. So it begins from that point that they see anything we do as against their interest, not as something which is understandable or comprehensible from India's domestic interest or from the Buddhist community's interest as well. And therefore, the objective of writing that paper was essentially to sort of shed light on this fact. And to suggest that since in the past our experience has been that making a concession has not brought a quid pro quo, that doing so in this case should be done either done with the expectation that we'll get nothing or not done. Assuming that if you show flexibility on a core concern that China has, they might show flexibility on a core concern that you have, is, I think, disproven by their behavior and their actions in the last 75 years.
You raised a number of possible outcomes and scenarios in this article. There was even an instance where you raised that things could start even before 15th Dalai Lama were to be identified. For instance, what, according to you, broadly speaking, should India's policy response be to this issue? I think it can almost be a foregone conclusion now that there will be two 15 Dalai Lamas, one perhaps picked by Beijing within the PRC and one in exile, presumably in India, but perhaps elsewhere overseas.
Yeah.
How would you sort of advise
Well,
India to deal
it's
with?
possible that there will be two, we can't say that. And
Right.
clearly, policy is something that I don't wish to weigh in on because that is for the government to do. My
Right.
objective was to basically outline the issues which might arise and which might become a complicating factor, not just in our relations with China, but also within our domestic constituency. The Dalai Lama himself holds a certain reverence in Indian society. Tibetan Buddhism is not simply Buddhism in Tibet because a lot of our own communities practice it. The international community is focused on this topic because Tibetan Buddhism is quite widespread now across the world. And for all these reasons, and because His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama lives in India, we are a focal point. And attention is going to fall upon us, the spotlight is going to fall upon us. And when it does fall upon us, we cannot be caught napping. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that a lot of people in the government must already be applying their minds to this. It is, after all, not a sudden issue that has come up. But the objective of my paper was not to list an exhaustive a number of things to be done, but simply to add to a debate which is already taking place in our country There are a number of people who have already written pretty good pieces on this about what the implications could be. I think the one useful contribution I've made is what you pointed out, which is to basically say we must not look simply from the very limited perspective of India China relations. We need to look at it from the broader perspective of China's own problems and the Sino US relationship.
That was Mr. Gokhale. Thank you very much once again for all your time. That was most insightful.
Thank you.
So